So another beautiful forest here. I mentioned, methods of harvesting, and if you argued with someone who's in this world, they might say there's all sorts of different methods. We're going to just talk about three. We'll talk about them really quickly. So the first method, the one that you might hear about, is clear cutting, and this has lots of historical connotation. We clear cut huge swaths of forest. Generally, that means you take everything or leave, just a couple of trees. Very well. In some environments where the forests grow very rapidly, it can be effective, especially if there's kind of spots of clear cut, right? So there's actually some great examples of this in Washington and Oregon, where, there might be a section of forest and they'll clear cut areas within it. And then over time, the forest that remains, all of this area that remains in timber will actually encroach and kind of fill those back in. There is, something to be said, when you clear cut an area, there's a lot more sun. So the next type of extraction is what we call shelter wood extraction, which means you can come through and take some of the largest trees and leave small kind of open areas between them. You can see here's a cross section of an area of shelterwood. So there still is, some mature trees, but there's more light that's getting down to the forest floor and allowing those new trees to grow more quickly. And then you can see in this last section, selective cutting, we go through and select individual trees. Sometimes this isn't so easy to do, but you might see like an Idaho helicopter, pulling trees up out of the forest. Would be an example of selective cutting. And again, it can thin trees, it can get out, disease. There's lots of benefits to thinking about selective cutting in a sustainable forest or a sustainable forestry. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the mechanics of you take a saw, cut a tree down. Obviously, there's a lot of really heavy machinery, skid logs and things like that. But once you've extracted the logs from the forest, we have to get them somewhere. And generally, there are two places we take them. We take them to, three places. To a lumber mill, a plywood factory, or a paper mill. You can get there on trucks. Back in the day, you could be logging near railroad tracks and bring it down to the tracks and bring a train in and load the train up and get them out of there. Kind of most notably and most romantically, rivers, right? So we used to actually just take logs, pour them into these rivers, and then use the current of the water to take the logs to a place where, we would kind of purposefully built a receiving area in an area where you could get them off of the water. We still do that, actually. So you can see there's a couple of different methods. You could just dump all of your logs into the river and they just kind of jam on down the river doing their thing. If they get stuck, you got to go out there with some dynamite. And, we've all hopefully seen, cartoons or anything, these guys running on logs. But that works in a river. But actually, if you're in a coastal area or you have a well-controlled waterway, another way that people would do it is actually making log rafts. So you put together enough logs and you can actually strap them, tie them together. This is a pretty cool painting. I like that they have sails. They're log rafts. Obviously, wouldn't need to do that anymore. This is in Finland, just shipping some log rafts down this kind of controlled canal, getting them where they need to go, and you're not consuming any energy by doing it, which is great. This is actually another cool picture of a log raft that a tugboat is pushing near Vancouver, British Columbia. So again, if you can get the logs to the ocean, then you really can actually put together a fairly sizable raft. And take it to where you need it to be, right? Again, and saving energy. It's fairly easy to transport that way. End of the road, your logs get where you need them to be. Remember, I talked about kind of three things. So we've got a plywood factory, a lumber mill, and a paper mill. Again, keep in mind, I always simplify this stuff. So depending on where you go, different things are going to happen to the wood. So in a plywood factory, essentially what happens is the logs are basically peeled into these very large, thin sheets. Those sheets are then laminated with glue, like a glue-lam beam in a sense, but these are obviously sheets of plywood. You can see layers are alternating in grain direction. There's glue put between them. The whole thing is pressed together and cured. And you've got lumber, right? So that's, a pretty kind of regular thing for us to think about. Go to Home Depot and buy a sheet of plywood. Obviously, when that happens, and this is true in the top two cases, there's a lot of waste material produced. So not all of the wood is going to be in these nice sheets you could lay. There's branches. There's all kinds of other waste product. And actually, we do, in many cases, turn those into, particle board, chipboard, kind of MDF plywood, all of these different things that are kind of secondary products of the wood that's still, dimensional wood in a sense. So moving on to the lumber mill. So you can see here, once you have a log, you can kind of selectively, and this isn't the only kind of end log diagram that you could see. There's lots of different ways to do this, but generally you can see this is where lumber, like structural lumber you'd use to build your house, 2x4s, beams for other things, all sorts of things from, edging, trim work. I can't even kind of list them all off. But again, you can see here's the end diagram of how you could cut those out of a log, again, with these long saws, band saws, conveyor belts and things. So for the last example, paper mill, in this case, we're not necessarily using logs, although you can just chip logs, but you start with wood chips or small, kind of secondary wood products. And skipping through some of the details, we basically take an acid and we dissolve some of this material called lignin, and it leaves behind cellulose. So we've talked about cellulose with coal, right? So cellulose, you remember that guy. High in carbon and oxygen, and it's very fibrous, right? So the cellulose itself is actually what we use to make paper. So we use some acid, we dissolve the other gunk out of it, we get the cellulose. We take that cellulose itself and we bleach it. So rather than being this kind of brown, we get it kind of to this bleached bright white. That cellulose itself is mixed with additives such as chalk or other kind of whitening or normalizing agents, and put in these large vats and essentially flattened out and rolled into large sheets, which are then cut up as paper. So kind of backtracking through this lecture on, or backtracking through this module on wood and its use, about 30% of it ends up used as paper. And I always think it's interesting, people will ask about, well, we don't use newspapers anymore. We don't use as much paper as we used to, that we've got emails and all those sorts of things. But the first thing my mind goes to is, how many times has Amazon been to your house this week, right? So we use boxes for shipping now much more than we used to, but the kind of day-to-day office paper is pretty reduced. So for this last bit, I wanted just to talk about I guess the finances of timber, of the timber industry. So this diagram, stale. I always apologize, but I like to let you know this is 2013. So the proportions probably haven't changed all that much. And it shows you the states that most heavily rely on selling timber, right? They heavily rely on the timber industry. Maybe you could have guessed this, maybe not, but you can see Washington, Oregon, obviously leading the charge, right? Those are the states that are really kind of famous for their logging. California, Idaho are on there. Down in the south, things are a little bit different. There's not as much softwood. There's more hardwood that's recovered down there. But you can see most states have a significant timber industry. And even those that kind of register as white, still there's some level of industry there. So again, kind of building on this financial aspect of the lumber industry, This is a list of companies, including packaging companies, like they make boxes, paper companies, and then also forest product companies. So they're not all exactly the same. But here you can see, in the United States, International Paper is kind of leading the list of the highest sales, kind of bouncing down. You see Boise Cascade in there, right? So that's, headquartered here in Idaho. Our lumber operations aren't what they used to be, but we're still, Boise Cascade is still on the list, although I think it's changed its name now to just Boise. Further down the list, close to the bottom here, you can see Potlatch. And that's the pulp factory that's in Lewiston, if you've ever spent any time in Lewiston. So again, the timber and lumber industry and forest product industry out west is pretty financially important. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is really this kind of financial shift in forest products and how we recover the stuff, at least in the concept of like who owns the land. So in 1979, here in green on the left-hand side, I guess I'll back up. Got some stuff in my way. I'm trying to make sure they've got enough room to see the graph here. So in 1979, the largest landowners were forest products companies, right? So famously, Boise Cascade owned all of this land, all this timberland in Idaho. And so it made sense, right? The companies who used the forests would own the forests that they were extracting from, right? It makes perfect sense. But that's really changed over the years. So you can see in this second graph, you can see that the ownership has changed from companies like Boise Cascade, that they themselves are companies. Now there's kind of a third agency involved that kind of oversees the land. And these kind of range, you can see here on the bottom, we have REITs, which is a real estate investment trust. So they're owning the land, right? But then they're leasing it to be used by these integrated forest companies. And then TIMO, Timber Investment and Management Organizations. So again, these are almost like third-party folks who own the forest land, but then the forest products companies themselves haven't changed. They're just no longer in the land business. And again, that's something that you see in the news in Idaho all the time, right? So people will complain about losing access to a certain part of the forest that they've been going to, as a family tradition to, recreate or hunt or whatever. That used to be Boise Cascade land, right? And then since then it's sold to private organization, private individual, or of either of these, types of groups, right? So kind of real estate investment teams or, timber management organizations. So that's going to do it for wood, but we've got a lot more to get through in the industrial. This is one of my favorite sections of the class. So, all right, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.